his interest in literature began when a cousin, returning from World War II, dropped off a box of 19 books. They were boys' adventure books. Sergeant Silk, The Prairie Scout, was the first book that he pulled and read. From that point on, he saw books as his escape route out of cowboying and into writing and reading. And if anything, he wanted to be a full-time reader. That's how he wanted to spend his life. If he could have made a living as a reader, it would have been doing that. So he fell in love with books, developed a passion for books. And when he was at UNT, he was a book scout. He was out buying books already. And I brought some of those books with me that he actually purchased as a book scout back in the 1950s. In his early books, he actually signed his name on the inside of the books. He was so proud of the books that he acquired. And that became really the catalyst for his immersion into the book world. He became one of the most renowned book collectors in the world. People knew him everywhere. And Larry was always, he was an aggressive book scout. He was a progressive book collector. He went out to every major book sale that he could find. Typically it would be somebody who had a private collection. They were deceased. He'd be the first one in line and got the books that he wanted. That's how he became an antiquarian bookseller.
So Tom brought up the fact that I'm Larry's literary torchbearer. What does that even mean? Well, it means that Larry and I were good friends. I met Larry way back in 2006 when I was running a creative writing class for the University of North Texas. And my boss, a guy named Mitch Land, suggested what better place to hold a creative writing class than in Larry McMurtry's hometown of Archer City, Texas. So he sent me up there to see Larry and talk to him about seeing if he would mentor a group of students. Can you hear me okay, by the way? So I went to the bookshop where he was at Booked Up, and he was sitting on a blue ladder, curating, pricing books as he did every day. I later learned. And I said, "Hey, Larry, I'm a professor from UNT, and I was wondering if you would be interested in mentoring a group of students that I'm bringing up that want to do some creative writing in your hometown." And Larry said, "Absolutely not." And I said, but Larry, you're a graduate of the University of North Texas. You got your BA in English there. Why wouldn't you want to mentor a group of students? Well, he wouldn't tell me, and he just sort of shrugged me off, and I left dejected. I later learned that he had started a writing program at a local university, that a new dean had come in and decided to tell Larry how to run his own program, and that didn't go over very well with Larry. The program didn't last very long, and so Larry wanted nothing to do with academia. Well, the next year, we came back and continued to thinking that maybe Larry might change his mind, and we didn't know. But we had produced a little book called Spurs of Inspiration about Larry McMurtry, about the town, about his ranching heritage, about his life as a cowboy, about his writing life. And Larry read it. And when I was in town in 2006, he called me up and said, "George, come on over, I want to see you." So I went to the Lonesome Dove Inn, which was a bed and breakfast that was being run in Archer City at the time. It was during the heyday of Booked Up. And I went over there, and Larry actually handed me a glass of wine and said, "What do you need?" And that was it. We became good friends in the process of running workshops. Larry loved readers and he loved writers, but he loved readers the most. And we would conduct workshops inside of his famous internationally renowned bookshop called Booked Up. Raise your hands if you've been to Booked Up. A few of you have. And during those workshops, Larry would always end the workshop with the same mantra. It was, okay, you all want to be writers and you all want me to drop magic dust on you and teach you how to be writers. But he said, if you really want to be a writer, stand on the shoulders of the 500,000 writers that I brought into this town. They were all authors inside the town with 4 bookshops. And he even kept the bookshops open all night, and of course we did. He said, immerse yourself in their work, model your own writing after their writing, and then and only then do you have a chance of becoming a writer. So that's how I got to know Larry, and over the years he was incredibly generous. We would, not only did he conduct workshops in his bookshop, but he invited us into his home, into his private library, which is one of the most renowned private libraries in the world. He had 30,000 volumes of the books that he cherished and loved and held and clutched and smelled, and I'd see him in there at night after he was curating books. He just was in love with books, just loved them. So that's kind of how we got to know each other. I also went out to his ranch house 18 miles south of town. It's called the McMurtry Ranch on Idiot Ridge. The locals called it Idiot Ridge because at the end of the ranch there's this cliff, and sometimes the McMurtry cattle would spook and they'd run off and kill themselves at the end of his ranch. That's why they called it Idiot Ridge. And Larry actually referred to Idiot Ridge in his first 2 novels, Horseman Passed By and Leaving Cheyenne. He writes about his ranch. They're both books are autobiographical, very much about the family. So with all that, I think I'd like to read to you a little passage now that you know that I'm not a cowboy at all. I am a wannabe cowboy, I guess. I'm trying to channel Larry because he was a real cowboy. So I'm wearing his garb, the kind of stuff that he would wear as his literary torchbearer. He'd probably laugh at me, but here I am trying to channel Larry as best I can. And I was even trying to channel Larry in these 38 essays that we put together in this book, Pastures of the Empty Page. This book is a book that I hope you'll all read at some point. It's a book that of 38 writers that were deeply and profoundly impacted by Larry's life as a novelist, as a book collector, as a teacher, as a screenwriter, and as a close friend. And this is, I'm not going to talk about this in my talk, but one of the things that Larry had is these deep, enduring relationships with women.
In terms of him being a psychologist, one of the most interesting things about Larry McMurtry is there is not a man in the world, another author in the world that could write about women as well as Larry could. And Larry said that the reason he was able to write about women, and he said he agreed he could write about them pretty well, is because he understood women. He was surrounded by women in his household. He saw the dynamic tension between his father and his mother, and between other women and men in his household growing up. And I think he did psychoanalyze that and paid attention to sort of the conflicts and the tensions. And he always was, I would say, his tendency, more than a tendency, it was definitely his, I would say, his absolute need to understand women. He really wanted to understand women. He spent a lot of time with women. In fact, the last book he was going to write was about the 62 women in his life, which included a lot of movie stars, Sybil Shepherd and Diane Keaton and people like that, but also some very ordinary women, some of which wrote about their relationship with Larry in our book, Pastures of the Empty Page. But yeah, Larry definitely understood women better than most men. He sympathized with women, empathized with women, cared about women, and carried on these relationships with women his whole life. And I'll never forget, I've a very dear friend of his who, Diana Osana, who they were co-writers together. She was his writing partner. She said that she would get calls all the time while he was living in Tucson from women who wanted to talk to Larry and have Larry just discuss their whatever issues they were confronting. So you talk about Larry being a psychologist. I think he definitely served in that role in many instances.
So I'm going to read you my opening introduction to Pastures of the Empty Page. And by the way, before Larry started work on any novel, you should know that he was very he was deeply rooted in what he called his blood country, the ranching countries surrounding Archer County. He had worked the ranches, he had helped other ranchers. All of them did kind of communal ranching where they worked on each other's ranches and did roundups together and all of that. And so before he started work on any novel, and I'm going to ask you in a minute how many novels he wrote, but before he started work on any novel, he would go back to the ranch and walk around the perimeter of the ranch. It's about 1,200 acre ranch, dirt roads. And that's Larry walking around the perimeter of his ranch, trying to summon the ghosts of his past, trying to having these recollections of his grandparents who were ranchers and his uncles and his father and all of that. And they became, it served as his sort of, he would channel, just as I'm trying to channel Larry with my crazy cowboy outfit, Larry would channel his relatives and cowboys of the past, ranchers of the past, and as he walked around the ranch. This was his writing ritual, which I thought was always interesting. So I was happy that the publisher included this picture as the cover for the book. So I just want to read you a short passage from this book. By the way, every dollar from this book is, I'm Larry's literary torchbearer, so I myself individually, and nor none of the writers get a nickel from this. It all goes towards the Literary Center, the Larry McMurtry Literary Center, to help keep the lights on and help keep his legacy alive. All right. Place is Idiot Ridge. It looks like any other cattle gate in rural Texas, as crude and rough as the ranch behind it. A rusted stirrup, the ranch brand, is mounted on top, and its white paint is as rigid and cracked as the ground beneath. But this is no ordinary gate. It marks the entry to the McMurtry Ranch, a scruffy plateau bordered by the rocky ledges known by locals as Idiot Ridge. It's the place where stories were told and passed around even before Larry was born in 1936. He would become one of the most influential Western writers of the 20th century, shooting holes in the romantic portrayals of the Old West. Beyond the cattle gate, a dirt road leads up to a mesquite-covered hill. Here, over 100 years earlier, Larry's grandparents unhitched their wagon and made a life. And it's the spot where Larry's life as a storyteller began. Throughout his life, before starting work on any of his novels, Larry felt impelled to walk the perimeter of the McMurtry Ranch, gazing upon that hill that would shape his literary destiny. To this day, Larry wrote many years later, "If I attempt a rural setting, I invariably produce the contours of the hill where I first walked." Growing up on Idiot Ridge, he felt the power of the big western sky, the empty plains and endless horizon breaking over the ridge and stretching north all the way to Montana. Riding out in the early dawn through dewy grassland, watching the sunlight turn the prairie gold, enthralled him. He later wrote, "The hold the landscape had on me was so powerful, I couldn't imagine living in any other place." Larry lived on the raw edge of a frontier, gasping its last breaths. Raised in the shadow of his pioneering grandparents, he heard story after story of the free-spirited McMurtry cowmen running cattle on the open range. By the time he was born, the open range had been cut up into fenced pastures, but his grandfather kept 2 longhorns on the ranch, wild and powerful beasts that had once roamed freely across the southern plains of Texas. And in fact, in Hud, the venerable cattle rancher that is the main character in the story has 2 longhorns, so it's his grandfather. The power of its previous inhabitants, the Comanches and the Kiowa, had been broken a decade before the McMurtry's arrival in Archer County in 1888. But fear of their return remained. As he grew older, the young cowboy saw the deep blue sky and rolling prairie that had once enchanted turn treacherous. Tornadoes barely missed the barn, grass fires licked at the homestead, and the sandstorms and cloudbursts buried the ranch in dust and mud. His horse, Polecat, dragged him through a mesquite briar, ripping his skin to shreds. He was swept up in stampedes, hurled off a horse when a steer panicked in a lightning storm, and trapped on the wrong side of the surging Little Wichita River. As he recalled, stuck on a weak horse in a world of mud. He saw cowboys crushed under their horses, a teenager decapitated by a drilling rig, his father's unending battle against the mesquite that choked against the precious grass on the hill. As he watched, a split developed in Larry's Western soul. Year by year, the young cowboy became increasingly disenchanted with romantic notions of cowboy life and with the traditional frontier values that governed his own family. As his sister Sue Dean observed, Larry saw the loneliness and the futility in their lives. And you should know that Larry also became disenchanted with the Zane Greys and the Louis L'Amours and other pulp fiction writers that portrayed the American West in such romantic terms. The cowboy riding off into the wilderness, the Lone Ranger, that version of the cowboy in the West. In Lonesome Dove, Hud, and all of his Western novels, you probably know that Larry's aim, he didn't succeed, but his aim was to basically dismantle the cowboy myths and basically point out the harsh realities of the cowboy way of life, the ranching way of life, and the violence of the Old West. But instead, Lonesome Dove and many of these other novels reinforced the notions. And Larry grew extremely frustrated through, as life went on, he'd be interviewed about Lonesome Dove or Hud or Leaving Cheyenne or Streets of Laredo or all his books. And they were all the critics would always say, well, Larry, you've now created this groundswell of interest in the Old West, and this is fantastic. We're really excited about it. And Larry would look at them with just sort of disgust because he said, that wasn't my intention. I didn't want this to happen. These aren't realistic portrayals that we're seeing in movies. So yeah, that was sort of the bane. It's interesting. People think Lonesome Dove, everybody has read Lonesome Dove. I'm sure raise your hands if you've read Lonesome Dove. Okay, not everybody, but almost everybody. That's good. So I have a question. In his 50 years of writing, beyond Lonesome Dove, how many books did Larry produce, do you think, beyond Lonesome Dove? You can't tell me, but let's start. Do you think it was 10? 10 books? That's pretty prolific output for a novelist. Okay, 20? Raise your hands if it's 20. I'll just do it in 10 decimals. 30. 30 novels, okay. 40 novels. 1, 2, 50 novels. 50 novels and nonfiction works. He wrote 50 works. That's his body of work. The literary critic, I love this quote from Dave Hickey, who knew Larry well. They were longtime friends. He said, if you leave a cow alone, he'll eat grass. If you leave Larry alone, he'll write books. And so that's pretty much the case. And as you know, many of his early novels, I believe were turned into, were adapted for the big screen, including his first book, Horseman Passed By. Can you imagine an 18-year-old writer whose first book was adopted to the big screen, starring Paul Newman and all of that? The book didn't do very well, but the movie did, and that catapulted his career early on. And many, most of his early works were adopted for film. Leaving Cheyenne, The Last Picture Show, Terms of Endearment, Texasville, all of his early works were adapted to the big screen, as well as some of his later works. And as you probably know, Larry became so popular, so famous, that many even academics have written books about Larry, literary criticism of Larry, academic works looking at, was Larry this, was Larry that? We have a bunch of books in the Literary Center by academics and scholars who have, while he was alive, and now there's hundreds more books that are about to come out about Larry. I was invited to an SMU symposium where there's about 300 academics that are all going to sit around and dissect Larry McMurtry's work and decide whether it was, relevant or not relevant, or whether how he treated women and how he treated blacks and how he treated Indians and all of that stuff. There's going to be a lot of sort of soul searching going on about Larry McMurtry in the years to come, and all that's probably good. I'm going to ask you all a question in a moment, but I think that I guess that sort of demonstrates. I'll ask you a question. I think this is important to know because I'm in the process of trying to weigh the same question that I'm about to ask you. Is there anyone in this room who would question whether Larry McMurtry is Texas's greatest writer? Raise your hand if you would question whether Larry McMurtry is Texas's greatest writer. Okay, not a single person. So everybody in this room feels that Larry is Texas's greatest writer. Well, I can tell you that there is no shortage of literary critics. You'll find this surprising, I think, even in Texas, who would challenge the notion that Larry is Texas's greatest writer. And I run into them all the time. They would argue that while Lonesome Dove, in the Last Picture Show, even Moving On, even, his early novels were all unparalleled literary achievements. They don't question that. But they say that his later works and his sequels, ranging from the Barry Bender narratives — raise your hands if you've read the Barry Bender narratives. Do you even know what those are? Well, the Barry Bender narratives are essentially about a group of Englishmen who came to America and they're on this hunting expedition. It's pretty interesting. I happen to like it, but a lot of people don't, and it's received all kinds of criticism and praise. There's kind of this split between whether the Barry Bender series are good or bad. This is the kind of assessment that's going on now that Larry's dead. But Larry did tell me directly, for what it's worth, for those of you who are interested in reading the Barry Bender series, it's kind of a soap opera in some ways, but I found it intriguing, an intriguing soap opera. But Larry said to me, he said, "You watch, when I die, the Barry Bender narratives are going to become classics." So he was convinced that those books were going to be among his best work. This is the kind of I would say, assessment that's going on now about Larry McMurtry's work, which is quite interesting to me, especially since I'm running the Larry McMurtry Literary Center, and scholars are coming in all the time, and readers and bibliophiles and book collectors, and everybody has an opinion about whether Larry McMurtry, whether his literature is going to be sustainable, whether 200 years from now Larry McMurtry will be read. And I happen to think he will, but we'll find out. But there are those critics, plenty of them, and they were at various universities in particular where scholars like to debate, the merits of literature, who feel that his skills were dramatically diminished as he got older. And they say that he wrote too much. He was very prolific, as you've learned from writing 50 books. That's a lot of books. That quantity outstripped quality. I'm not going to ask this as a question, but some critics even contend that writing so many sequels and tetralogies, to the Last Picture Show, Terms of Endearment, Lonesome Dove, he had sequels and prequels, and it went on and on and on. I don't know how many of you have read all of the Lonesome Dove series, or have you? You've read them? Okay. So I wish I could ask you a question. I'd be very interested in knowing what you think. Well, we can talk. You can raise the question later. So I'd like a show of hands, now that I've made mention of the fact that there is literary critics out there, who would say that his later novels didn't quite measure up to his earlier works? Raise your hand if you would say that. We've got one person who has the courage to say yes. Okay. Well, I think, this is important, and what I'm asking these questions for is important for me, and it's important for the literary world, because these posthumous assessments that are being done in the university level and in places like this, where I'm asking these kind of questions, they're going to play a critical role in determining whether Texas's literary star joins the world-class elite, the greatest writers in the world. I'm talking about James Joyce and Franz Kafka and, Thomas Wolfe and Jane Austen, and many of these writers are all on the shelves of Larry's bookstore in Archer City. They're the very writers that Larry was reading. And he always measured himself against those writers and always considered himself a minor regional writer. But anyway, so this assessment is going on, and I think it will likely take years, even decades before there's, I say, a universal assessment of whether Larry McMurtry's popularity earns him a permanent place in literary history, among the Dostoevskys, among the Tolstoys, among the Jane Austens of the world. We'll find out, but like millions of other McMurtry fans, I believe that Larry McMurtry stands atop the summit, atop the very summit right now of the Western literary canon. And why do I think that? Why do I believe that? Well, because can you think of another world-renowned author that has forged, I would say, a new brand of literature about the American West? There isn't. There isn't another writer that's accomplished what Larry has. Somebody who has debunked the myths and the sentimentality and the stereotypes. McMurtry's characters were, I would say they were cut from a different cloth than the characters of the Old West. They were conflicted. They were hurting. They were longing. They were characters that were seeking and longing for something better. In fact, I wrote down a little note on my way over here. I said, the central tenet of Larry's characters, the very central tenet, is that they're trapped by life. They're trapped by life in some way. Whether they're on that ranch in South Texas and they set off for a better life in Montana, or whether they came from, suburbia, like they did in Moving On. The character Patsy in that book is, she feels trapped in her life and she's torn and she wants to do something with her life, but she can't. She's struggling. She's trying to find a way out. She's yearning for something better. The Last Picture Show, we could go on, or whether they belong to the despairing village of people in Archer City. Larry saw that and tapped into that, and that became the central force behind every book that he ever wrote. That sort of conflict, that tension, that understanding that that these characters were searching for something more than what they had, something more than what they felt they needed. So I guess one of the things that I would like to talk about now is there's going to be no shortage of literary critics in Texas, as I said, that are going to challenge whether Larry's, a world-class writer. But the one person that I think matters, and it's important to consider, that really does and consider himself in the same echelon as these world-class writers, is Larry McMurtry himself. To me, it's astonishing that despite all of his accomplishments, he won every literary award imaginable. And yet, he considered himself nothing more than a minor regional writer. And I always thought, I remember going up to Larry one time and saying, Larry, you call yourself a minor regional writer, but you don't really believe that, do you? This is after he won the Pulitzer Prize. And he said, and here's what he said. I think I wrote this down. Yeah. Yeah, I did write it down. Here's his response. He said, people like Dickens and Thackeray that looked like major writers when they were writing, they don't look so major now. They are not beyond reach. Literature is fed by minor talents. Mine is certainly. So, this is the man that we all agree, you all agree that he's Texas's greatest writer, but he didn't see himself as anything more than a minor regional writer. Even though, as I said, he redefined Texas literature in every possible way. creating these unforgettable stories and unforgettable characters drawn from his life growing up on Idiot Ridge, on this hardscrabble ranch outside his hometown of Archer City.
Larry did consider himself a minor regional writer, and a lot of people thought he was being facetious or self-deprecating, and he really wasn't at all. He really believed that, but that's because he measured his career, his life, his body of work against all the world-class writers, against the Tolstoys, as I mentioned earlier, against the Tolstoys, the Dostoevskys, against any of the world-class writers you want to name. He saw himself in that, he put himself in that sphere. And so even Lonesome Dove, which won the Pulitzer Prize, he said it ain't no masterpiece. In fact, he grew tired of all the critics saying it was a masterpiece. He got sick and tired of talking about it, frustrated talking about it, because he felt his whole goal in writing that book was to debunk the myths of, the cowboy myths and romantic portrayals of the American West. But as it turned out, it had just the opposite effect. It in fact, reinforced everybody's sentimental notions about the American West. And it really frustrated Larry a lot. That book frustrated the heck out of him. The longer, I'd love for him to be here right now answering that question, because I'm sure he would express even more frustration than ever before that you're even asking me about it. He would dismiss people when I was in rooms with writers where they would ask him about Lonesome Dove. Can you talk about Lonesome Dove, Larry? No, I'm not going to talk about Lonesome Dove. That was how he felt about it.
It's very interesting to me that as a cowboy growing up on the ranch, and I always come back to his authenticity as a writer. He was able to write authentically about the cowboy way of life, the cowboy mythology, the cowboy myths, and all of that, because he was a cowboy. And he knew the life. And he knew, as I tried to portray in the passages that I read to you earlier. And as he's growing up as a cowboy, he didn't have the vaguest notion that he would end up as a writer. He didn't have a clue that he would be a writer. And all he knew, and he wrote this in one of his memoirs, he said, I would have to deal with cowboys either successfully or unsuccessfully because there was nothing else in sight. That's all he had, was the cowboy life. And he wasn't happy as a cowboy, like so many people in town and elsewhere. He felt trapped on the ranch, like so many of his characters. But then his life changed when he was 6 years old and his cousin dropped off a box of 19 books. He was coming back he was going to World War II. And this book, this box of books changed everything, changed Larry's life in countless ways. But he pulled the first book out of the box. It was called Sergeant Silk, The Prairie Scout. It was the first book he pulled out of the box, and a new way of life opened up for him. He saw himself no longer as a cowboy, but as a reader, which is really interesting. And that, being a reader, was something that opened up opportunities for him that he couldn't have even imagined. As I wrote in the introduction to Pastures of the Empty Page, this small stable of books gave Larry a feeling of independence, freedom, which he didn't have before. He was trapped on the ranch, felt sequestered on the ranch, felt there was no way out. But that box of books changed everything. He told me literature as I saw it then was a vast open range, my equivalent of the cowboy dream. So Larry continued to work on Idiot Ridge as a cowboy after this box of books was dropped off, moving cattle, mending fences, do all the things that cowboys do. But as I wrote in Pastures, his head was every place but on the ranch. He said, reading those books his cousin gave him became the central and stable activity of my life. Making a living would have to be made to fit it somehow, but if I could help it, it would not involve cows. So those books, as I said, changed everything. It became the catalyst, not only for his passion for reading, but it expanded into writing and then book collecting. He became not only a prodigious writer, but as fate would have it, that small collection of books also became the seed that would eventually sprout Booked Up, And I don't know, a few of you had been there, but Larry's vision for Booked Up was not just to create bookstores in Archer City. He had 4 bookstores across the country, and he brought his first bookshop he opened in 1971 in Washington, D.C. Soon he started expanding. He had a bookstore in Houston, then he had a bookstore in Dallas, then he had a bookstore in Tucson, and he kept expanding. And then in 1987, he said, you know what? I'm going to change everything. He was bold and audacious, and he said, I'm going to change my town. He said, I'm going to create a book town in Archer City. Do you know of any other author that has done that? There isn't another American author that has turned their hometown into a book town, but Larry did. He brought in 700,000 books from around the country into Little Archer City, bought up 4 buildings. One was a car dealership, one was a meat market, that kind of thing. We happen to be in the former car dealership. We still have car parts all over the place. But that's what sprouted Booked Up in Larry's town. He was bold and audacious. And that's the thing. We had 300 kids yesterday, grammar school kids from across Archer County, and they were coming into the bookshop. And that's what I told them. I said, if Larry McMurtry can teach you anything, some of them are reading, by the way, as literature, which impressed me, even the 4th graders. But I said, if Larry can teach you anything, it's to be bold and audacious. You know, you don't have to, if you're a dairyman and you don't like being a dairyman, which a lot of the kids were from Windthorst, some of them were working, some of them are children of parents that are, 9-to-5 jobs, or not the kind of jobs that some of them aspire to, but they said to me, even as young kids, we don't know, there aren't a lot of jobs here. I said, well, look what Larry did. Look what he did. Larry wasn't kidding when he said he's an accumulator, because not a book collector. And what he meant by that was he liked accumulating books, but he didn't like selling them. I was in the store many times. I don't know if any of you had that experience when you went into Booked Up, but I was in there many times. When Larry was in the store, his clerks weren't there. Somebody had spent hours inside his bookshop finding this book. Looking for a book. They finally found the book they were looking for. They'd go into the showroom area. We had this old-time cash register. It's still there. And Larry would walk behind it. He'd look at the book, and some lady or some man would say, oh, I'm so excited, Larry. I spent 2 hours looking for this book or these books. Finally found it. I'm so excited. And Larry would look at them and look at the book and go, geez, ma'am, I'm sorry I haven't read it yet. I'm not going to sell it. He really didn't want to sell the books. And I'm now, unfortunately, for all the volunteers that are working at the Literary Center, I'm now taking on that sort of persona, because there's a lot of books that people are coming in wanting to buy, and I just don't want to let them go. So if you want to buy some books from the center, you better get there quickly, because I may just put a kibosh on all the selling of Larry's books, because they're so precious. And just to give you a quick idea, these are the kind of books that we're finding all over the place. They're mixed in. There's $20 books mixed in with $15,000 books. This happens to be a $15,000 book that was sitting on the shelves. It's Ernest Hemingway, The Old Man and the Sea. And it's a first edition, but it's not just a first edition. It contains the Scribner seal, which means it's the first 50 books published by the publisher. And so this book is worth about $12,000. Just to give you an idea. And then we have books from the 16th century, the 17th century, the 18th century. There's so many books. By the way, I would urge you, if you want to find out more about Larry's book collection, read his memoir books. This particular book describes all of his book collecting ways, the people where he bought books, how he acquired books, his book scouting years at UNT, at Rice, and other places. And the last book collection that he got was by this person who he spent 20 years trying to get his collection. His name was Ralph Witherspoon. We have about 10,000 of his books. He was a private collector. Larry hunted this collection, called this guy every year saying, are you ready to sell? You ready to sell? Never would sell it to Larry, but then he died, and his wife called Larry up, and he was on a plane the next day and went out and bought his collection. This book came out of that collection. Now you know why he was pursuing that collection for 20 years. And he did. When he needed cash really badly, he could sell a book, a $15,000 book, to a rare book collector, and it was just like a form of money, which I always found interesting. I've never thought of books as forms of money, but Larry saw them that way. Okay, how much time do we have, by the way? As long as I want. Oh, well, you may be here for a couple more hours then. Let me tell you where we're at now. So you saw Larry talking about books. He had 700,000 books roughly in these 4 stores in Archer City. In 2012, maybe some of you were there, Larry had what he called the last book sale. And he was downsizing his herd. That's the term he used, downsizing his herd. Why was he downsizing his herd? Well, his son, James, is a fantastic songwriter, but he's not interested in books and literature. So he didn't have anyone to leave his books to, or he felt that would be interested in his books, so he decided to downsize his herd. So he brought in collectors and bookstores from all over the country. They were coming with semis, and he sold off 250,000 books in one day. I was there at that auction, and it was Larry was going up and down the aisles, putting on a happy face, acting like this was the best thing that could happen. Were you there, Rusty? Yeah, he was putting on a happy face for everybody, pretending this was the greatest day of his life, talking about how his books were being migrated to other parts of the country and what a wonderful thing it was. At the end of the day, he looked just crestfallen. And wow, I'll never forget going up to him and saying, I thought he was going to break down. I said, Larry, how you feeling? He just shook his head. It was the worst day of his life. He had to get rid of these books. He loved his books. He was passionate about books. If you want to understand Larry McMurtry, understand this. Yeah, he was a great writer. He was a good teacher. He was an okay cowboy. But the thing that he was most passionate about, the thing that kept him going for 50-some years was books, book collecting and reading books. And he loved readers. When readers would come in, he always could identify a reader because they'd spend time in the bookstop and in the bookstore. They wouldn't just come in and out. If somebody came in and said, Larry, where can I find this book? He would say, ma'am, I have no idea where the book is. I'm sorry, you'll just have to forage. I have no idea. He knew exactly where every book was, but they'd go off and I'd say, Larry, they'd run around looking for the book, another hour, and they couldn't find the book. And I'd say, Larry, where's the book? Second shelf, third row down. He knew exactly where every book was, but he wasn't going to tell anybody where the books were. He wasn't like, he wanted people to be inquisitive. He wanted people to forage. He wanted people to find books that maybe they didn't come in the store looking for, but suddenly they found a companion like he did, So books were, it's sort of like, where can I find this particular book? When you go into a bookstore, he would never engage in that activity. In fact, it repulsed him. That's how much he loved books. And he felt close to all of his books. That's the thing. It wasn't like he was selective about books. If you asked Larry, what's your favorite book? All 500,000 of them. That's what he'd say. So how did we end up, the Archer City Writers Workshop, end up acquiring the book? I'll try to make this short. In his will, Larry left his bookshops to his longtime store manager because his son wasn't interested in the bookstore. So he left it to Crystal Collins, and she wasn't interested in keeping the bookstores going either. So she was looking for a buyer, and she quickly found Chip and Joanna Gaines were looking for, I should say Chip was looking for the books because they were building a new hotel in Waco called 1928. How many of you have been there to that hotel and seen the library? Well, they were building this new hotel, and they needed 10,000 books to fill the library. And they didn't know where to find books, that many books anywhere. So they decided to buy the bookstores. So they bought 2 of Larry's last remaining bookstores that had about 300,000 books. And they bought them and took 10,000 of the books to their hotel in Waco, and they created the Larry McMurtry Library in their hotel. You can go see it. It's the same books that we have in our shop. But after that, they didn't know what to do with it. So they didn't know that they could how to operate it as a bookstore. They weren't in the book business, and they had really no interest in running it. So they heard that I had been running these workshops in Archer City with Larry for 15 years. So I got a call, and they said, would you be interested in buying Booked Up? I said, heck yeah. So we spent a long time negotiating, and 1 year ago this month, we bought the bookstores from the Gaineses, and now we're running it as really call it a shrine to Larry McMurtry. It's the whole purpose of it is to preserve and perpetuate the books, but more importantly, to preserve and perpetuate his literature and his legacy. And everybody in there, we have all volunteers. We're all doing this because of our love for Larry McMurtry. All of us have ties to him in different ways. And we're all energized and elated every time somebody comes in from the bookstores. And we've got people coming from all over the country, New York to California, that are McMurtry fans. He's got fans from all over the world. I suspect that we're probably going to start getting fans from other countries when they hear about us. We're only open on the weekends, but we've had hordes of people coming in, and it's just been so exciting to see the joy that people have coming into his bookshop. And the first thing some people cry. If you go to our website, Larry McMurtry Literary Center, look up the Voices. It's an Instagram page, and you have people in there that are laughing and crying and joyous. It's just been quite an experience. I had no idea that Larry McMurtry's created such an emotional reaction in people that they just love the bookstore. They love Larry. So I guess, so now we have about 300,000 books left. They're all marked by Larry's hand. He priced them, he read them, not cover to cover, but they're marked with his hand. And so we get collectors coming in that are wanting to buy them, and we're selling them, most of them for about $25 each as a donation. And then the collectors are coming in and buying them and selling them online for $75, $100, $150. So it's it's not a comfortable thing for me to be in. And then we also are selling Larry's private library collection, which are all marked and branded with Larry's book plate. The book plate is actually an image of Larry's family ranch brand, which is a stirrup. And each of those books is branded. And I brought just one to show you. This is Wallace Stegner. Larry was a Stegner fellow, so he had several Wallace Stegner books. That's the ranch brand. Can you see it? Yeah, all the books that he coveted most. These were his literary treasures from his private library, a 30,000 volume library. I mentioned it earlier. It's one of the most renowned libraries in the world. A fellow by the name of James Gannon, a good guy, he's a member of our advisory board. He bought all the books, and he's selling them out of Addison, which isn't too far from here. But we're also distributing for them. But frankly, I hate to sell them. I just hate to see them go, because I spent a lot of time in Larry's private library, and it's just hard to part with him.
When Larry died in March of 2021, there was no funeral service, no memorial, no nothing. So the woman that I was working with, Kathy Floyd, on what's called the Archer City Writers Workshop, which we had been running there for years, but it became more of a professional organization later on. When we no longer associated with the University of North Texas, we continued to bring professional writers, and we still are bringing professional writers to Archer City. Everybody knew of that association, and so the writers all suggested that we needed to do something, and they turned to me and said, what can we do? And I talked to Kathy, and we decided to put on a memorial service to celebrate Larry's life and legacy inside the Royal Theater. So I asked a bunch of writers, I think it was 12 or 13 writers, to pen essays about Larry's impact on them as writers. And I asked them, I said, would you mind reading them aloud at the Royal Theater as part of our celebration? And they all agreed, and they came, and they read their essays aloud. There was a packed crowd at the Royal Theater, and there seemed to be a kind of a groundswell after that to produce a book about Larry's life, legacy, and impact on American letters. And so, again, I was tapped to sort of edit that collection, and I got 38 some writers to work on it. And many of whom were deeply and profoundly impacted by Larry's life, by his mentoring, by his literature. Not everybody even knew Larry that wrote about him, but everybody's been impacted one way or another. I don't think there's actually any Texan that wouldn't be influenced by Larry McMurtry, and I think that's even developing more today, because young people now are coming into the Larry McMurtry Literary Center and telling me that they're reading McMurtry because they feel that their world is so fungible that it's nothing real. There's nothing authentic about it. And they feel that Larry's literature is visceral and real and tangible. And so it's interesting, we're getting more and more young people now coming into the center.
Are there any questions?
Questions, comments, protests? This is a library. You can say what you want.
I think you look great in that outfit, by the way. I think that should be your new book.
I'll tell my wife that.
So, since you obviously had very personal conversations with him, was he happy? The books that he wrote that were turned into movies, was he happy with all of them? Was he unhappy with any one of them? Of course, Lonesome Dove was a series, but...
Right. He was more happy with some of his books than the other. To say that Larry was happy probably doesn't represent the way he would express things. He would never say, I'm happy or sad. He had this sort of Western demeanor that was, aw shucks, or, yeah, it was okay, or that kind of thing. He would never say, oh yeah, I was really excited. It was fantastic. I loved the treatment. But he did feel very good about some of the movie adaptations, particularly The Last Picture Show. He loved that depiction. He loved Bill Whitliff's 6-part series, the mini-series, that it was done by Bill Whitliff, not Larry. Bill Whitliff wrote it. He said there was nothing more authentic. There was no more authentic adaptation of a book to the screen than Bill Whitliff's adaptation. And so that was the greatest endorsement that Larry McMurtry would ever give to a film.
Questions, comments, protest?
No protest, no protest whatsoever. So out of the more than 50 books that he authored, did he ever disclose to you that these are my most favorite 20 or 30? Or was it all of them in entirety?
Yeah, the one series of books that he did predict were going to be classics were the Barry Bender narratives. That's the only one and only collection. He did say that, like, for example, he dismissed, and it bothered me a lot. I never brought it up to Larry, but it bothered me a lot. He dismissed Leaving Cheyenne and Horseman Passed By as juvenilia. Juvenilia. In other words, the kind of stuff that an unseasoned writer would write. And maybe in retrospect, looking back, it wasn't his greatest work, but I've reread Leaving Cheyenne and HUD several times. I still think it's among his best work. So I was surprised by that he would dismiss some of his earlier work. But the Lonesome Dove thing is something I understand his frustration with it. I feel sad that he wasn't able to enjoy the worldwide acclaim that book received. I mean, people from all over the world. It's published in every language. I mean, you can go into Russia and find that book. It's in Czechoslovakia. It's in Japanese. It's everywhere, and that's how the appeal of that. Most people don't know that it was translated into every language. We've got a number of the translations at the Larry McMurtry Literary Center.
Questions, comments?
Yeah, do you know if there's any finished manuscripts that might see the light of day at some point?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Yeah. Is there any finished manuscripts that might see the light of day one day, or is there anything?
Well, that's a good question, because I'm trying to find out who has a copy of his 62 Women manuscript. He started work on that. He was actually doing, call it, interviews with the women, and I've heard different accounts from friends of his that are friends of mine that Larry actually produced the manuscript, but nobody seems to know where it is. if that was actually produced, I hope we can find a way to publish it, because that would be very revealing. He just called it 62 Women. Larry didn't hide the fact that he was working on that. Unfortunately, his health went really south after he started working on it, and he had all kinds of cardiac issues, and he died before he got it done. But I would like to say one thing about Larry that I think says a lot about his joy. What's interesting, even though he was this harsh critic of Texas literature, saying it never measured up to what he thought it could be, he was also the greatest champion of young writers. He wrote more blurbs, more endorsements than any writer of his stature ever. I mean, I'm talking about dozens and dozens. In fact, Tom had a writer here, Gordy Sauer, was that 3 years ago? He wrote this book, and this was a few months before Larry died. A few months before Larry died, he wrote a blurb, a beautiful blurb for this young writer, a new novelist, and it set in motion his career. It was like, if Larry blurbed your book, you had a chance of hitting it big time, of getting literary agents, of getting publishers to take notice if Larry McMurtry endorsed your book. And he did. He did it a lot. And it still shocks me. He never talked to me about that. I'm finding this out now posthumously. And it just is another side of Larry's generosity that people don't know about. A lot of people think Larry was a curmudgeon, and they'd go and see him, and he wasn't the kind of guy that was going to sit there and socialize with you. But if you love books, if you cared about literature, if you cared about reading, if you were a reader, he called himself an aggressive reader. If you were an aggressive reader, meaning you read more than a few books a year, he really would take a liking to you. And he also took a liking to young writers because he felt that they needed help. That's why he welcomed all the writers that I would bring there every year. And he took them under his wings and talked to them and shared with them and coached them and helped them. I mean, he didn't need to do that. He wasn't getting paid to do this. He did it just because he wanted to help create a new generation of Texas writers that actually measured up to world-class writers. That was always his ambition. Nobody understood that. So that was his quest. I hope that now we're continuing to run writing workshops in Archer City. We're running a fiction workshop next November. It's going to be, I think, really an exciting workshop. It's by this writer that was deeply influenced by Larry McMurtry, and I want to make sure that writers that come to the center and are going to be mentoring other people are going to be McMurtry acolytes. And so we're pretty excited that we're continuing to do these workshops, continuing to carry on Larry's legacy in that way. Yeah.
Questions, comments?
Since it seems that he was really focused on the sort of the human condition, who of his characters, who do you think that he cherished or loved the most, of the male characters and of the female characters?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, as I said earlier, he definitely identified with the female characters. Patsy Carpenter was clearly a woman that he identified with in Moving On. And that's a good example where this woman was torn between two loves. And the conflict and the tension and what came out of that relationship, and her yearning to find something beyond what she had and trying to find someone that would help fulfill her dreams and her needs and her ambitions. And Larry was a master at that. He tapped into that in a way. So I would say she was probably, he did mention that she was a character that he really loved. And then there's Leonora Wood, the prostitute in Lonesome Dove. He really identified with her, so put upon and yet so determined to do something with her life. And she was going to get to San Francisco come hell or high water, and that sort of great ambivalence between the woman that was prostituting herself to get to a place she was trapped, like so many of her characters, trapped in this life and finding a way out. And I know Larry, very few men could have written that character, this multifaceted character that Leonora was, that the way Larry did.
Any last minute?
This is probably in your introduction, so I'm admitting I have not yet read it, but how did you assemble the 38 contributors to this book, and were there writers that you wanted to contribute and they didn't for whatever reason?
Yes, there was a number of writers that I wanted to contribute. Leslie Marmon Silko was one of them. She wrote Ceremony. She's a Native American writer, very close to Larry. Larry helped her a lot. He wrote an introduction to Ceremony, and she was one of a number of high-profile authors that I wanted to write and contribute to the collection that I wasn't able to land. It wasn't because they didn't want to do it. It was because they were pressed against some awful deadlines. They had some other publishing commitments. Some of them were out of town. There wasn't anybody that said, "Oh no, I'm not interested in writing about Larry McMurtry." It wasn't that. It happened to be sort of professional scheduling issues. But I could go down the list, but there's really no point. They're not. I mean, even Diana Osana, it was hard to get Diana, and we've become good friends and working together on her essay, and it's a beautiful essay, but she was in pain. I mean, she loved Larry McMurtry, and, trying to write about her relationship with him. It was a platonic relationship. They worked together for years, produced several books, and of course, Brokeback Mountain, they wrote that together, the screenplay. But she was just torn apart. She was just emotionally spent. I wasn't sure that she was going to be able to write the piece. Took a long time to get it out of her, and that sounds crass, but it was like, I could understand. It was like dealing with somebody who was just in a terrible emotional state. So there was a lot of that going on too. A lot of people were really hurt, I'd say, in ways that I probably shouldn't share about his death.
Anybody else? I guess I'll ask the last question. He seemed self-critical. Was that a reflection of low self-esteem, or was that a reflection of his Texas upbringing where you're taught not to brag?
No, Larry didn't brag, that's for sure. He was self-deprecating, and that's sort of a Western trait, I think, the sort of, aw, shucks, I'm not good enough kind of thing. And Larry always grew up with this. Remember, he grew up as a cowboy, and he wasn't a very good cowboy. And the other cowboys let him know it. So that's why he was so anxious when this box of books came along to find something else to do. But yeah, I think that was part of it. In fact, throughout his literature, if you read his literature, there's a number of characters that Larry really identified with because they didn't have much self-esteem, and he identified with those characters. They're in Lonesome Dove. They're in every one of his books. You'll find characters that suffer the same sort of trait that you've identified in a very shrewd way. I'm glad you brought that up.
Well, I was calling the last page of the last chapter of a book called The American Farmer. My grandparents were ranchers. So I remember being 12 years old, and the other boys could take that lasso and get that calf, and I'd take that lasso and it would go over there and the calf would go that way. And, so when I was reading about Larry McMurtry, I said, I know that guy. That guy is me.
It's important that Larry's literature remain relevant to new generation of readers and writers, particularly readers, because Larry transformed literature. I thought his literature was more than profound. It changed the way we look at Texas, the way we think about Texas, the way we think about the American West. He rebranded the Western novel in a way that I think is it's a great achievement. And I think that Larry's, even though he called himself a minor regional writer, I totally disagree with him. I think he was a world-class writer, and I think his legend is going to grow and grow and grow. And based on the sort of reception we're getting at the Larry McMurtry Literary Center, people are coming from all over the country. They still want to immerse themselves in his life, in his books, in his writing. So I'm hopeful and optimistic that serving as Larry's literary torchbearer. First of all, I hope that that's something he would want me to do. I don't know, but I hope it is. I pray it is, because I think for me, it's a great honor to be able to carry on his legacy. The worst thing that could happen to Texas is if Larry McMurtry were forgotten, and the American West. And so many writers, famous writers, are forgotten, and they're sitting on the shelves in Larry's old bookshop, famous writers of the past that nobody reads anymore. And that would be a shame and a pity if that happened with Larry, which is why we're doing everything we can to make sure that not only his book collection, but his literature and his legacy remain, that we put it out into the public constantly, because everybody needs to remember this guy. I'm also pushing to get his work required reading in the schools. Yesterday we had 300 school kids come in from Archer County. 300 came into the bookshop, and all I did was talk to them about Larry McMurtry, and I was pleased that some of them are already reading. Even in the 4th grade, they're reading Larry McMurtry. So I do have high hopes. The torch, I felt, was sort of the torch that I'm carrying, felt like it was the flame was rising when the kids came in. It made me feel really good. It was hopeful to see these kids that were so enthusiastic about Larry McMurtry, about his life, about his literature. There's one 4th grader that was talking about leaving Cheyenne, and he grew up on a ranch, and he was talking about, how difficult it is and the struggles and all of that. And he said, I love Larry McMurtry.